Welcome back to One Sustainability, our 2022 conference here. We're now joined from Massachusetts by the CEO of Equal Innovation, Nish Acharya, who is going to be speaking to us today about public-private partnerships and accelerating that to climate resiliency. Nish, thank you. Welcome. Hope you're having a good day. We look forward to your remarks.
I am. Thank you very much for that introduction, Glenn. Look forward to sharing some thoughts on what we've seen over the last year with all of you in terms of public-private partnership development. Once again, I'm Nish Acharya, and I wear two hats that I'll mention in this case that are, I think, relevant to the audience. One is running an organization called Equal Innovation, but the other is that I'm a senior fellow for inclusive economic recovery and growth with the Clinton Foundation. And we just had the Clinton Global Initiative a few weeks ago, which brought together a lot of folks thinking about climate resilience and economic growth. And some of my slides will share some of the insights from that meeting as well. I look forward to doing that. And so why don't we jump in with my presentation. So as we think about next steps in this, I think the first is really to frame the big challenges that we're facing as a world. Sustainability is a huge topic. It means different things to different people. And I think we really need to understand what's the role of the private sector, what's the role of the public sector, how do these different things come together to address sustainability moving forward. So the public sector approach is really around institutions and societal changes. And so that might include the private sector, but really it's the role of government, civil society, business organizations, really sort of moving in collaboration to move the world forward. And so where we're seeing the world and the public sectors come together around the conferences like COP26, this year COP27, is really, I think, two things. One is mitigation and understanding that, if we're going to keep temperatures as close to the 1.5 number as we can, even though we're destined to go over it, what are the mitigation techniques that we can use? What's the development, deployment of technologies and the policy realm to do that? A lot of this will be technology transfer, regulatory regimes for maximizing sustainability, this sort of thing. And the second, of course, is just going to be adaptation. We already know that climate change is affecting big, cities and regions and their economies. And so adaptation is essentially what can we do to be proactive, whether it's seawalls or materials for buildings, or thinking about how we finance economic growth and to be more sustainable. This is a big part of adaptation, and it's at the government level that we're thinking about many of these things. These are the public sector approaches. On the flip side, there's a bunch of areas where the private sector is leading, and that's really where we talk about innovation, entrepreneurship, breakthrough, supply chain transformations, things of that nature. And of course, these are in the biggest sectors where climate change and sustainability align, right? So these are the areas where industry and the private sector are the drivers of the industry, as well as the leading innovators. So electrification of transport is one of the biggest ones. One of the biggest drivers of climate change is transportation. So electrification has been a big area, and clearly we've seen a lot with electric cars and others in this space. Secondly is the decarbonization of the grid, which is, again, systems-based. In most countries, the providers of electricity and energy are private companies, even if they're quasi-public utilities. They're usually managed separately from government. And so there we're seeing, obviously, a lot of innovation, everything from the innovations in the panels, solar panels or wind turbines, but also in supply chain and delivery and batteries. And electrification and decarbonization is where now the leading sources of venture capital in the sustainability space. So there's money going into sustainability. The two biggest areas are this decarbonization and electrification. The third is in agriculture, where about 14% of greenhouse gas emissions are in the agricultural space. And so we're seeing quite a bit around regenerative agriculture. And for those of you who don't know the space, we're not talking about everybody becoming organic farmers. We're talking about agriculture that uses less inputs, be it water or seed or land, and systems that are circular in nature, where the food is biodegradable, where we minimize waste, all those sorts of things. So again, investment going into this space, the food industry itself thinking a lot about this as it transitions from sort of old, water-intensive, waste-intensive agriculture to more efficient. It's more efficient is more financially profitable anyways. And so this is not purely about sustainability and climate change. This is a move around bottom line as well. Biodiversity, again, this is more a philanthropic space. This is not a corporate space, but biodiversity is something that's identified in the Sustainable Development Goals and the COP26 process, but it's really private philanthropy that's looking at this. I was involved with the X Prize Foundation, which is doing some major global challenges, $8 million, $10 million, $50 million around private sector solutions to improve biodiversity. And so, again, perfect examples of the public sector setting the priorities and the private sector coming through with capital and solutions to address that. Lowering industrial emissions, obviously, that's an area where every industry has made commitments at COP26 and are looking for support from government. This is where the carbon credits market, first established by the private sector, then mandated by government, and now being followed by the private sector, is a good example of public-private partnerships where companies are pushing towards net zero with support from the government and sometimes mandates that they ask for to get to net zero. And then, of course, carbon removal is early stage technology, so I won't get into that too much, but this is really the core of where innovation funding is going, is around technologies that will help us reach that 1.5 goal, but are still unproven. So a lot of things in this space are innovative, early stage. We're hoping they show progress, and there's a big market for it. And as I mentioned, there's sort of roles for everybody in this, if you will. The big thing we need to think about, why is the public-private sector partnership so important? And if some of you have heard me speak, you know I tend to harp on this fact that the UN Sustainable Development Goals are really large goals set by the world that they'd like to achieve. And as you can see, several of them relate to the climate. Number 11 is sustainable cities. Number 13 is climate action. 14 is life below water. 15, life on land. For all of these, we need money. If we are to do things at the status quo, we have annually 2.5 trillion less than we need to achieve our climate goals and our sustainability goals. So there's only two ways to do this. One is significantly more money from the public sector, which is unlikely if you think about global politics right now. The other is significant innovation from the private sector that leads to solutions at a lower cost that allows us to address these things. And that's why it's so important. It's not just that companies and startups need to be responsible citizens, but we need to innovate and scale those innovative solutions if we are to achieve our collective goals as we defined in the Sustainable Development Goals. And so that's why this is so important that we think about mitigation, adaptation, all these new technologies, and where we need to go. So I wanted to share a couple of what we've seen in the private sector that it relates well to the topic here. So what we're seeing is governments are really looking at this issue of sustainability in a couple of ways, right? So they're developing their own ESG practices that's environmentally sustainable, socially beneficial, and strong organizational governance. And so they're developing their ESG metrics. That how do they measure their supply chain, their investments, where their treasury invests, all of these sorts of things. And then they're building their models around that. But a part of it is they're really looking much more at impact of what they're doing. So it's one thing to say we're going to have new metrics for being sustainable as our footprint is sustainable. But what about your vendors and suppliers? And what about the region you work in? And what are you doing when there's a disaster to make the region more sustainable or rehabilitate it? So they're looking at a little bit more around impact that relates to their sustainability. And again, a big push on this is innovation and entrepreneurship. What are the technologies we can adopt quickly to meet these goals? And who are the entrepreneurs working on that we can work with? The second thing is companies are looking at sustainability and impact in a very different way. They're looking at core global corporate practices and integrating them for a topic like sustainability. 10 years ago, if you said sustainability, it might have been done out of the corporate foundation. And then maybe they're set up a sustainability office. Now we're seeing something very, very different. We're seeing companies say that this is straight related to the mission, and we need to develop capabilities to innovate and be sustainable, just like we would to reduce the cost of our product or to improve the product for the next generation. So that's very different. It's become mission critical. Global best practices. This was not something we saw in the world before in terms of sustainability, but now it's quite common for folks to say, this is what I did in Asia, let me apply it to North America and vice versa. And then, again, integration with organizational processes, using the staffs that we have, taking processes like agile and lean, which was for software development and product development, and saying, what's the learnings there around sustainability? And so these are big changes where companies are saying, if we are going to meet the sustainability goals we set and the climate change deadline that we have as a world, we need to be agile and lean. We need to think about this much more comprehensively and holistically. And so that's now being applied, not just in sustainability, but also in diversity, equity, and inclusion in the sustainable development goals at large. So one of the reasons this is possible is that a lot of innovation now is coming out in these sectors. So this is more broadly based on the impact space. But what we're seeing is about 20% of the startups in accelerator programs around the world are actually in the climate and sustainability space. And another 1/3 are in this education and global health and that sort of space. So there's a lot of funding going into sustainability. There's a lot of startups coming out. And some are doing things like, these carbon capture technologies that are really amazing. And others are doing more basic apps around behavior change. So tracking your meat intake or tracking your footsteps, your footprint from driving or living. So whatever it is, this is a significant investment in sustainability related solutions. And now there's, we're really focused now on solving the bottlenecks to that. So policy is aligning with the COP26 agreements last year. Capital is surging into this climate change and sustainability space. And the incumbent players, there are no incumbent players. There's no Microsoft for sustainability, and there's no others. And so it's the Wild West. A lot of organizations can grow and succeed in this space. So what's some examples of startups that are doing this that we want to think about? So, I think we can say that, we're seeing, as I mentioned before, these sort of couple of buckets where innovation and private sector funding is going. So inclusive access to clean electricity. We're seeing a lot of commitments at the Clinton Global Initiative around this particular one. So again, a lot of interest in providing electricity to rural areas around the world, off-grid solutions, low-cost solutions, mitigation and adaptations we talked about earlier for dealing with cities and particularly coastal areas, agriculture, and then disaster and risk mitigation. So again, unfortunately, disasters keep coming and we need to prepare for them a little bit better, particularly climate-led disasters. One example that received a lot of attention recently was how in Puerto Rico, a lot of the healthcare facilities are now have transitioned to solar power, even before commercial industries have, simply because Puerto Rico is getting a lot of hurricanes, and as the power goes out, the one institution you want to keep power on is the hospital. And so that's been an example of disaster and risk mitigation where industries are really sort of, the solar sector is targeting those that need to be taken care of first. A couple of examples of some of the ones we're seeing, around the sustainability and climate change space. So, and these are mapped to different SDGs, but as you can see, they're all climate change and sustainability focused. So NanoSafe is tracking the chemical content of water supplies. This is again an area where clean water is a big part of why people migrate, why cities are overstressed, and so whatever we can do to fix this problem. Even in the United States, we saw this problem in Jackson, Mississippi, just a few weeks ago. SDG 7, PowerMark, and what they're doing around localized power, solar power for communities, so that they don't need to be on a grid. We know that the cost is lower and it's more efficient, and those customers don't want to change utilities once they're connected. Textiles is another area we highlight here, and then chemical cleaning processes. So what we're seeing in the startup space aligns very much with what we saw in the other slides about where people are investing their capital, where they see the problems and the needs. Moving along, there's a lot on this chart. but this is a little bit to map out for you, what's going on between government and business and the NGO sector in each of these big areas that we identified before. So if we just take electrification, for example, there are corporate efforts run by BMW, UPS, others, which are obvious around electrification of what they're doing. Nearly every car maker has announced electric cars and the phasing out of non-electrics by 2050, as COP says, the COP26 protocol agreed to do. Similarly, governments are involved in this. The US Department of Transportation, cities and mayors around the world, are setting their own plans to remove taxis on combustion engine vehicles and switch city vehicles. And so governments are becoming not just regulators, but they're the prime purchasers of the electrification technology, which is helping these companies build their businesses. Obviously, there's a lot of funders working on this. And then in academia and the innovation space, you have a lot of growth in research funding. The US Department of Energy just announced a multi-billion-dollar green hydrogen energy program, which will then sort of be sent out into universities and research labs to commercialize technology around hydrogen, which will then obviously be used by the BMWs and the UPSs and others. And so and again, at the local level, a lot of the culture change will be driven by community groups. And so we see that across the space here where there's funding and there's regulation at the government level, and then there's a lot of involvement from large companies, as you see here, business, Unilever, CBRE, others. So nearly everybody has made COP26 commitments, and everybody's waiting on the government to tell them what to do with those commitments as they move forward. So last couple of slides. So at the Clean Global Initiative, we had organizations that were announcing their commitments to action around climate resilience. And as you can see, this is another example of how diverse the world is of climate commitments. So you had some very large publicly traded companies like Aspiration and others that were making commitments. You then had Empire State Realty Trust, which is using its capacity as one of the largest buildings in New York and affiliated buildings that they work with to really push for climate change. And then we're seeing incubators like LA Clean Tech Incubator launching funds for entrepreneurs in this space, debt financing, other things. BRAC, which is based in Bangladesh, doing some work around empowering women, small and medium enterprise women in Bangladesh who have lost their livelihood because now it's too hot to work outside during the day. And so if you had a tea stall, but now the tea stall can't be used because it's 100 degrees outside from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m., then these people need loans to switch their industries and move into something else. So lots of different activities going on across the board, from small NGOs all the way up to large companies, and all making different commitments in their space, related to the other topics that we saw and heard about. So with that, we're finding, I'll just share what we do a little bit just so it gives you context. We do a lot of scouting for innovations around the world. And so we work with large organizations like the UN, Fortune 500 companies, investment funds, and we are seeing without a doubt that there's about 5,000 innovation accelerators and startup accelerators around the world. And nearly all of them have a climate and sustainability track now. What that means is that we're seeing an incredible output, at least 1,000 to 2,000 quality startups working on sustainability, launching every year around the world. And this is important for two reasons. One is that these startups have solutions that are relevant for the climate crisis and for becoming a more sustainable world. And the second, and possibly the more important one, is these are geographically dispersed around the world. So when you look at the United States, venture capital is only in 3 places: California, Massachusetts, and New York. But there are high quality sustainability focused startups at the University of Michigan, at the University of Texas, at the University of Nebraska, all around the world. And so the more startups we can launch and support where they are, the faster we can see these solutions dispersed. Once again, if you can build a company doing sustainability in Malaysia or in Nigeria, they will be the suppliers and the vendors to big companies in their regions. And that's going to expedite how fast we can deal with climate change and sustainability. And that's why it's so important we think about geographical dispersion in addition to traditional factors like product and team, because we need to move fast. We can't wait for the traditional model where Silicon Valley comes up with a product and then 20 years later, or 5 years, 10 years later, it's in the rest of the world. We need stuff to move faster. And so it's going to be important that we work with startups and innovators from around the world to address the climate crisis. So I'm going to stop there. I want to thank all of you for participating and leave some time for questions.
I'm sorry, I hit the wrong button. It's like he disappeared. He disappeared. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So it sounds a little bit like, you think about it, startups to the rescue, right? You think about all of the innovation, all of the credibility that's out there around the world. Why shouldn't we think outside the box, right? When you think about trying to solve, why do we have to stick to, and not to sound 60 years old like I am, but old established frameworks, right? Why not push the envelope a little bit and come back and say, well, why shouldn't we challenge these types of things?
Yeah, and I think the big thing will be also for sustainability, thinking a little bit differently about the financial model. So for climate change, there may be things that are not billion-dollar products, but they are very important for achieving our sustainability goals. And we're going to have to find ways to finance those things, even if we don't necessarily, investors are going to have to figure out, how to take a longer approach, be more patient, that sort of thing. I think that's going to be a big part of this because not everything is going to give you a 10x return.
Well, we've had over the course of the week here at One Sustainability, we've had a couple of B Corps involved too, where you kind of get that mindset where it's embedded in your culture that this is more of a long range play. Don't tie me necessarily to quarterly earnings.
Yes.
And expectations like that. So you kind of get a little bit longer tail there. Now you mentioned the phrase mission critical, which is always important. I was with a friend of mine last night, and he's been in not-for-profits for a long time. And one of the phrases he likes to use is called return on mission, right? As opposed to really return on investment. And you come back and say, are you really putting forth those types of things that really drive that forward? When you work with the Clinton Foundation and you're working on some of those private and public partnerships, how much let's see, what's a good way to say it? How much arm wrestling do you have to do to kind of get them to kind of see the larger picture and try to get involved, or is it an easy sell?
It's actually an easy sell in terms of being involved. I think we are now at a point where every company, every investment fund, everybody knows they need to be net zero in what they're doing or as sustainable as possible. Even in the oil and gas industry, they're working diligently on efficiency because they have to. I think the challenge comes in, one is where do you focus? Is it batteries? Is it supply chain? Is it, materials? And that's one big area. And then the other is, what's the risk tolerance? Obviously, this year we've seen with the war in the Ukraine, there's some hard realities around energy that we all have to address, and that's set back the sustainability space. And unfortunately, that's the world we live in. And so, if there's been hesitancy, it's around how much risk are people willing to take, and then where do I focus, right?
You also had the UN Sustainable Development Goals, right? Out there at the 17, and then looking to solve them or work on them, you had new models and new technologies. In your experience, as some of these entrepreneurial startups come into play and they work on this, what's the chances that some of what they put forth by way of technologies or models that they can actually maybe assist with multiple instances of what's on the tables there for the 17, or is it really one at a time? I mean, I'm not sure what your experience might be if some of these are cross issue perhaps.
Yeah, so I think a lot of them are cross issue. I think the SDG framework was done to address a lot of topics, right? So the issues of biodiversity, the tools that are being developed are useful for oceans as well as for forests and land. And so that's an example where the goal has been to improve biodiversity. The UN has defined it has 2 different SDGs. I think there's a lot of innovation we're seeing. Girls' education is both gender and education, and most people are looking at those multiple SDGs together. I think a lot of investment funds that are in the impact investing space do align themselves and tag themselves by one of the SDGs they work on. And what we found, and I took this slide out of this one, but now you can actually tag about 50% of the startups coming out of the major accelerators and startup programs as tagging themselves to one of the SDGs. And so that's real progress, I think, in terms of the private sector saying, these are problems and we're going to address them.
Yeah, and you had one on one of your slides, and it's a topic that I've been working on and following a little bit over the last year and a half, but you had agile kind of transformation in there. And I think that's a key, when you think about thinking outside the box, right? And being flexible and being able to pivot quickly. I thought that was a significant point that you had down.
Yeah, again, I think the big change there is to say, what do companies do well? And let's apply it. Let's not view these things as side things. Let's make it integral to the work we do. And so, the talent in the front office, the, NGOs need help with accounting, and we have a big, CFO and a whole accounting department. They need help with talent. We have an HR team. We have our own supply chain. So not just, making it mission critical, but also thinking about the assets of the company and how that can be utilized to address these global challenges.
Yeah, I mean, it really needs, from an organizational process standpoint, it really needs to be almost embedded in the culture and become like a way of life, at least from the organization standpoint as they go forth, right?
Yeah.
Well, listen, thanks for joining us. Great talk here. I mean, we've had a really interesting week, and you bring a really fresh perspective there. So we thank you for joining us today. Nish Acharya, Acharya, there we go, from the Equal Innovation, as well as a senior fellow at the Clinton Foundation. Really appreciate the talk and the presentation. Great job. Look forward to seeing you next time.
Great. Thank you so much, Glenn and Stelios, and see you soon.
Thank you. Be well. Bye.